Now in this video we'll see how to configure DMVPN phase 2 using static NHRP mappings, and we'll try to understand the set of commands to be configured on individual routers, and then we'll get into the command line and we'll configure and verify the same. So if you want to configure DMVPN phase 2, like if you remember, in the case of phase 2 we use multi-point GRE everywhere. We are going to use multi-point GRE on hub as well as spokes. Now the mapping can be done either manually or automatic mapping. In this case, in this scenario, we are going to use static mappings. So we'll try to configure a multi-point GRE tunnels, which allows you to have virtually point-to-point multi-point tunnels from router 1 to 3, 2, 3, 4, and also we can have tunnels can be established between spoke to spoke. Now the configuration is almost similar to what we did in the phase 1, but there are some slight changes, like on the hub it's going to be the same configuration. So the first we'll create a tunnel interface, and then we are going to assign the IP address. So I'll be using 10.001, 10.002 on the router 2, 10.003 on the router 3, and 10.004 on the router 4. And then we are going to set tunnel source. Source can be either an IP address 15.001 or it can be interface name. And as we are configuring multi-point GRE, so the destination will not be present, we need to configure tunnel mode GRE multi-point command. And after that we need to enable the NHRP. This is a command we need to, once you give this command, it's going to enable the NHRP, and then we need to map individual spokes if you are using static mappings. So we need to map 10.002 has to be mapped with the NBMA address, and 10.003 has to be mapped with the NBMA address here, and 10.004 has to be mapped with the NBMA address of the router 4. Now in the case of spokes also, the configuration goes exactly similar. Like here you can see the IP address will change, and this configuration is exact same. In case of phase 1 we have used tunnel destination, but in the case of phase 2 on the spokes, it allows you to have spoke to spoke tunnel establishment. And then we need to enable the NHRP and then the mappings. So as we need to have some dynamic tunnels to be built from router 1 to router 2 to router 1, and the router 2 to router 3, and router 2 to router 4, we need to have a mapping has to be done manually. So if you are not using manual mapping, in that case we can go with dynamic mappings as well. We'll talk about more on dynamic mappings probably in our next video. Now in this section we'll try to verify the phase 2 configurations using static mappings. So let's get into the command line to verify the same. I got the same diagram. You can see the router 1, 2, 3, 4 are pre-configured with the exact IP addresses, and I have reachability from the NBMA address of router 1, router 2, router 3, and router 4. And we are going to configure the IP addresses 10.001, 10.002, 10.003, and 10.004 will be the tunnel IP addresses on the respective routers, and the NVMe addresses, we have reachability between the NVMe addresses. Now our requirement is we need to have a dynamic multi-point VPN established based on the phase 2, which allows you to have a dynamic tunnel built from router 2 to router 3, router 2 to router 4 automatically. So let's get into the command line here. I removed all the previous configurations, whatever I did, and I don't have any of the tunnel interfaces created here, and I just have reachability between my NBMA addresses of router 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's verify that. You can see I have reachability from, let me check from the router 1. So from the router 1, 25.002, that's the router 2 address, and then 35.003, and then 45.004. Now what I'm going to do is on the router 1, I'm going to configure the tunnel, which will be a multi-point GRE tunnel. So the tunnel configuration is almost same on all the routers. The first thing, we are going to assign the IP address on the tunnel /24 subnet mask, and then the next command will be tunnel source. I'll use S0 by 0 instead of IP address, and the tunnel mode will be GRE multi-point. And then the next command will be, we need to configure NHRP. I'm going to enable the NHRP with a network ID of 1, and then we need to do the manual mappings. So if you are using dynamic mappings, we just need to leave it blank. But in case of manual mappings, the static mappings, we need to map the individual IP address. Like the tunnel IP address of the router 2 will be 10.0.0.2 and the NBM address will be 25.0.0.2. Now in case of router 3 it will be 35.0.0.3, 10.0.0.3. In case of router 4 it will be 45.0.0.4 and then 10.0.0.4. Now that's it. These are the configurations we need to add on the router 1. Now if I go with the same commands, if I use the same thing in a notepad, so let's try to change the configurations on the router 2. Now on the router 2 we are going to use the same configurations. The only difference is we are going to change the IP address and then the tunnel source IP address will be same. A network ID you can either use the same IP or we can change, and we are going to do the mapping of router 1. Router 1 mapping tunnel IP address is 10.0.0.1 and the NBM address is 15.0.0.1 and the router 3 router 4 configurations remains the same. Let's copy the same configurations back on the router 2. So let's go to router 2 command line. On the router 2 let us create the tunnel and configure the same thing. The same thing on the router 3. On the router 3 the network ID we need to change the network ID, not compulsory, but IP address we need to change to 10.0.0.3 and instead of mappings of router 3 we need to type this one. So remaining all the configuration remains the same. So let's go to router 3 and configure the static mappings. And on the router 4, again we need to change the IP address and then network ID, NHRP network ID, and then on the router 4 we are going to do the mapping of router 3 mapped with the tunnel IP address 10.0.0.3 mapped with 35.0.0.3. So these are configuration on the router 4. Let's go to router 4 and then type the configurations, the same configurations. Okay, done. Now once we are done with the configurations, if you verify show IP NHRP detail, probably you can see the mapping information which is done manually by the administrator here. And then if I use show DMVPN, now you can see the DMVPN tunnel is created here. Now we have a tunnel created from router 4 to router 1 and router 4 to router 2 and router 4 to router 3. Now let's go to router 1 and verify the connectivity between the tunnel interfaces. Like from the router 1 I can ping to 10.0.0.2 and 10.0.0.3 and 10.0.0.4. Let's try to verify the same thing from the router 2, show DMVPN. Now if I try to ping to, I'm able to ping, let me try trace. So I'll try to trace to 10.0.0.3. I can see I'm able to reach from router 2 to router 3 directly without going to router 1. So it's going to build a dynamic tunnel between router 2 to router 3. And let me try to trace to router 4. You can see it directly goes to router 4. Now the good thing about this phase 2 is we can have a dynamic tunnels built from router 1 to router 2, router 1 to router 3 and router 1 to router 4, and also between spoke to spokes.